Hello beautiful people. Welcome to Vision Harry. In today's episode, we explore, what if Fleur's Veela magic bonded with 7-year-old Harry and Delacour family sued Dumbledore for mate imprisonment. Hit like, subscribe, and join our community of story lovers. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Accident at the Accord. The Ministry of Magic's visitor entrance on a Wednesday afternoon smelled like floor wax, old parchment, and the particular kind of bureaucratic anxiety that accumulates in buildings where important people make decisions that affect everyone else. The telephone box deposited its occupants into the atrium with a mechanical wheeze, and Vernon Dursley straightened his tie for the third time in as many minutes, squared his massive shoulders, and looked like a man who very much wanted to be somewhere else. Harry stood beside him, small and quiet in clothes 3 sizes too large, watching the golden statues in the fountain with the particular attentiveness of a child who has learned that looking at things is safer than looking at people. The statues were impressive, a witch and wizard standing tall, a centaur and a goblin and a house elf arranged at their feet in poses of cheerful subservience. Harry didn't know enough about the magical world yet to find that arrangement strange. He just thought the water looked clean. He wasn't supposed to be here. That much had been made extremely clear on the drive down from Surrey, Vernon's thick fingers white on the steering wheel while Petunia sat in the passenger seat and stared at the road with the expression she reserved for things she wished didn't exist. Harry was 7 years old and had accidentally melted the kitchen sink during an argument about breakfast, and the letter that arrived 20 minutes later via an extremely irritated-looking owl had been terse, official, and addressed to the guardian of Harry J. Potter in a way that suggested the sender was not accustomed to being ignored. So here they were. Vernon in his best suit. Petunia at home with Dudley, deciding quite firmly that this was men's business. Harry in Dudley's cast-off clothes, holding a small card that said visitor, escorted and trying not to look like he belonged. The atrium was busier than Harry had expected. Witches and wizards moved in every direction with the purposeful chaos of people who knew exactly where they were going and considered everyone else an obstacle. Some of them glanced at Harry with mild curiosity, the scar, probably, he'd learned that much, and some of them didn't notice him at all, which he generally preferred. There was bunting. Blue and white and gold, French colors, strung between the golden pillars in loops that kept shifting and rearranging themselves into new patterns every few minutes. A banner near the golden fountain read British-French Magical Cooperation Accord, 5th anniversary celebration in letters that occasionally broke free of the banner to dance independently before being pulled back into line. Harry thought that was brilliant. He kept that opinion to himself. Vernon found the wizard he was looking for, a nervous, round-faced ministry official named Perkins, according to his badge, who had the look of a man who had drawn the short straw that morning, and the two of them began a hushed conversation about forms and the incident report and liability. Harry drifted a few feet away, not far enough to alarm anyone, close enough to technically be supervised, and watched the bunting rearrange itself into what appeared to be a small Eiffel Tower. The French delegation had arrived the previous day, apparently. There were French witches and wizards scattered throughout the atrium, easy to identify by the cut of their robes and the particular quality of their stillness. They stood in groups of 3 or 4, speaking quietly, and they all had that air of people who were perfectly comfortable and didn't particularly need you to know it. Harry noticed a girl standing slightly apart from one of these groups. She was older than him, 11 or 12, maybe, and she had long silver blonde hair that moved slightly even when the air didn't, which Harry's brain filed under probably magic without consciously deciding to. She was dressed in pale blue robes trimmed with something that caught the light, and she stood with her arms crossed and her weight on one hip, watching the bunting with the critical expression of someone who has opinions about decorating. She wasn't the most beautiful person Harry had ever seen. She was the most vivid. That was the only word that fit. She was standing in the same space as everyone else but seemed to be in slightly sharper focus, like a painting where the artist spent extra time on one particular figure. Harry was 7 and didn't have the vocabulary for any of this. He just looked at her the way he looked at the fountain, because looking felt safe, and she seemed interesting. She turned, as people sometimes do when they feel eyes on them, and looked directly at him. For a half-second, nothing happened. Then something did. It wasn't dramatic, the way Harry would think about it later, it didn't crash or explode or announce itself. It was more like a key finding a lock it didn't know it was looking for. A soft, resonant click somewhere behind his sternum, followed by a warmth that moved outward from that point and settled into his hands and the back of his neck and the soles of his feet. His vision didn't blur or sharpen. The noise of the atrium didn't fade. He just felt, suddenly and without explanation, like he was breathing properly for the first time in recent memory. Across 15 feet of ministry floor, the girl went very still. Her arms dropped from their crossed position. Something moved behind her eyes, shock, first, and then a rapid, flickering sequence of emotions that Harry couldn't read because he didn't know her. Then she looked away, sharply, in the direction of a woman standing near the French delegation's main cluster, her mother, unmistakably, same bone structure and same silver blonde hair worn up in an elaborate arrangement, and said something fast and low in French. The woman turned. Her eyes found Harry immediately, with the precision of someone who already knew where to look. Harry looked back at her. She was extraordinarily beautiful in a way that made the air feel thick, but Harry was 7 and mostly just noted that she had the same sharp focus as her daughter, the quality of being more real than the people around her. She studied him for a long moment with an expression he couldn't parse, then crossed the floor toward him with the particular kind of unhurried purpose that meant she'd already decided what she was going to do. "You are Harry Potter," she said. It wasn't really a question. Her English was perfect and precise, with the kind of French accent that sounds like it's making English words more interesting by default. "Yes, ma'am," Harry said, because he'd been taught that much at least. She crouched to his eye level, which adults almost never did, and studied his face the way someone reads a document, carefully and with the intent to understand every word. Her eyes were a pale, clear gray, and she was close enough now that Harry could feel something emanating from her, not uncomfortable, but distinct, like standing near a fire without being warm enough to call it heat. "My name is Albus Delacour," she said. "That is my daughter, Fleur." She glanced back toward the girl, who had followed her and was now standing 2 feet behind her mother looking simultaneously mortified and riveted. "Something has happened between you two children. I need you to understand that we are not going to pretend it didn't." Harry processed that. Most adults, when something happened that they didn't understand, operated on the assumption that ignoring it hard enough would make it cease to exist. Vernon operated almost exclusively on this principle. So this woman was different. "Okay," Harry said. Apollin's expression shifted slightly. Not a full smile, something quieter than that. Like recognition. "Where is your guardian?" she asked. Harry pointed at Vernon, who was still deep in conversation with the round-faced Perkins and whose natural ruddy color had deepened to a concerning shade of maroon that meant he was either agitated or lying. Apollon stood, smoothed her robes, and looked at Vernon Dursley the way a person looks at a plumbing problem they've just been informed about, with the resignation of someone who is going to have to deal with this regardless. "Stay here, please," she said to Harry, which was such a novelty, please, as if his compliance was requested rather than commanded, that he almost said okay again and managed to stop himself. Fleur Delacour stepped into her mother's vacated space. She looked at Harry with an expression that was trying very hard to be composed and not quite achieving it. "You felt it too," she said. It also wasn't a question. "I felt something," Harry said carefully. "It was the bond," she said, and then immediately looked like she wished she hadn't. "My grandmère told me about it. Veela bonds." "I did not think," she stopped. Frowned. "You are very young." "I'm 7, Harry said. "How old are you?" 11. She said it with the particular dignity of someone who considers 4 years a significant gap. "What's a Veela?" Harry asked. She blinked at him. "You do not know. We don't learn about magic where I live." She absorbed that with a slight narrowing of her eyes that he would later come to recognize as her "this situation is worse than I thought" face. "A Veela is," she paused, seeming to choose her words. "We are magical beings. Our mothers before us, and their mothers before them. We are part human and part something older. Our magic is different from wand magic. And sometimes, another pause, another slight grimace, sometimes Veela's magic recognizes a person. A particular person. And when it does, it creates a connection. Between us? Harry looked at her with the directness of a child who hasn't yet learned to disguise curiosity as politeness. You're the Veela. Quarter Veela, she said, with some stiffness. And yes. The bond is partial, we are too young for it to be complete. But it is there. Harry thought about that click behind his sternum. The warmth. The sense of breathing correctly. Is that bad? Fleur opened her mouth, closed it, seemed to genuinely wrestle with the question. I don't know yet, she said finally, which Harry appreciated for its honesty. 20 feet away, Albus Delacour had reached Vernon Dursley, and whatever she said first made him turn around with his piggy eyes wide and his mouth open in the way that meant he'd been blindsided. Perkins took one look at the dynamic forming in front of him and remembered with great urgency that he had somewhere else to be. The conversation that followed was not long. Harry couldn't hear it, but he was good at reading body language, had years of practice reading the specific language of how much trouble are you currently in, Harry from across rooms. Vernon's posture went from defensive to confused to something Harry had never seen on him before, a kind of small, shrinking uncertainty. Whatever Albus Delacour was saying, Vernon didn't have a counter for it. She spoke for perhaps 3 minutes, hands still, voice level, and by the end of it Vernon was nodding and looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man trying to remember whether he'd agreed to something and what exactly the terms were. Apollon returned to where Harry and Fleur were standing. Your uncle has agreed that you'll join us for the remainder of the afternoon, she said to Harry. There is a private consultation room we have been assigned for the delegation. I want our diagnostician to look at you. Harry looked over at Vernon, who met his eyes for half a second and then looked away. That was new too. Vernon never looked away first. All right, Harry said. The consultation room was on the 4th floor and was furnished in the way of spaces that are temporarily occupied by important people. Everything in it was good quality and slightly impersonal, like a hotel that expected its guests to bring their own personalities. There were chairs with green velvet cushions and a long table and a window that looked out onto a magical courtyard Harry could see through despite being underground, which meant it was probably a painting or a charm, and he found he couldn't stop glancing at it. A man was already in the room when they arrived, tall, angular, with close-cropped dark hair and reading glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He stood when Apollon entered and said something in rapid French that made her respond in kind, and for a moment they spoke over Harry's head with the velocity of people who have already assessed the situation and are now just agreeing on a plan. Apollon's husband, Harry had gathered. Albus Delacour, with the particular self-possession of a man who does important work and doesn't need you to be impressed by it. And beside him, a woman in healer's robes who introduced herself as Madame Fontaine and immediately wanted Harry to sit on the edge of the table and hold still while she ran a series of diagnostic spells that looked like nothing so much as light arranged into different shapes, circles and lines, and once a structure that looked like a small skeleton made of golden thread. Harry had never had a medical examination. The Dursleys operated on the principle that Harry was fine unless he visibly wasn't, and even then the bar for intervention was set quite high. He sat on the edge of the table and watched the golden skeleton and felt less frightened than he probably should have, which he suspected had something to do with that warmth in his sternum that still hadn't entirely faded. Fleur had settled into one of the velvet chairs with the posture of someone trying to appear less interested than she was. She was reading a book, or pretending to, and Harry had noticed that she hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. Madame Fontaine worked in silence for a while. Then she began to speak in French, quiet and quick, and the quality of the silence in the room changed. Apollon's expression went very still. Apollon, beside her, took a long slow breath through his nose. What is it? Harry asked, because he'd decided earlier, arriving in this room, that he was not going to pretend he couldn't tell things were serious. Madame Fontaine looked to Apollon, who gave a small nod. Your magic, Madame Fontaine said carefully, in accented English, has been under extreme pressure for a very long time. You are 7 years old, and your magical core is, she seemed to search for an analogy, it is like a river that has been dammed. The water is still there. There is more water than most rivers I have seen in children your age. But it has been held back, and the dam is beginning to crack. Harry thought about the kitchen sink that morning. He thought about the time he'd ended up on the school roof in November and hadn't been able to explain it. He thought about the glass that disappeared when Dudley's snake came to look at him at the zoo last month, which had resulted in 3 days without food and a lock on the cupboard. What happens when the dam cracks, he asked. Nothing catastrophic, if we act correctly, Apollon said, before Madame Fontaine could answer. She had the tone of a person who is deciding to be honest because they've assessed that the truth is better. But it needs to be addressed. Your magic needs room. There is something else, Madame Fontaine said, and now she was speaking just to Apollon, in French, and this time Apollon put a hand out and gripped her husband's arm. Harry watched the grip. He was good at noticing things like that. The tightness of someone's hand on someone else's arm, he'd learned what that said about the situation underneath the words. Albus Delacour said something short and quiet. His voice was the kind of calm that isn't relaxed, the kind that comes from decision. Madame Fontaine, Apollon said, in English, deliberately. Tell him. The healer looked at Harry with an expression that he couldn't quite read, professional composure and something underneath it that might have been sadness, or anger, or both. There are signs of consistent underfeed, undernutrition. Not this week. Over years. There are traces of magical suppression that are not natural, the kind that come from prolonged stress and fear. And there are markings on your magical signature, she tapped one of the golden thread structures still hanging in the air between them, that suggest monitoring. Close, active monitoring. You have been watched, child. By someone who knows what they are doing. Harry didn't say anything. He looked at the golden skeleton of his own magic hanging in the air and thought, carefully, about all the times things happened and then adults arrived too fast, knowing too much. About Dumbledore, a name he'd heard whispered once on Privet Drive when Vernon thought he was asleep. About the way the letter that morning had arrived not 10 minutes after the sink. The bond with your daughter, Albus Delacour said to his wife, Harry had understood that much. And then a string of French too fast for him to follow, but the shape of it, the rhythm, suggested a question. Apollon answered it in a sentence. Then she turned to Harry. Do you know what your living situation is, formally, she asked. Who your legal guardian is? Why you are living where you are? My aunt and uncle, Harry said. My parents died. Do you know how they died? The question wasn't cruel. It was the directness of someone who believes the answer matters. Harry looked at her steadily. Not properly, he said. My aunt says it was a car crash but she says it wrong, she says it like she's saying a word she learned by rote. The other kind of person, the magical kind, they look at my scar when they see me. Like it's, he paused, like it's an answer to something. Apollon Delacour looked at her husband for a long moment. Then she looked at her daughter, who had given up pretending to read. Then she looked at Harry with an expression that was not pity. Pity would have been unbearable, he'd learned that, but something more like the look a person gets when they've just understood a problem in full and are deciding they're going to solve it. Do you want to know? She asked. Everything. As much as I know. Yes, Harry said, without hesitation. So she told him. Right there in the ministry consultation room with its green velvet chairs and its fake courtyard window, while Madame Fontaine quietly closed her diagnostic materials and Apollon poured tea that a small ministry house elf had brought without being asked and Fleur sat with her book face down on her knee and listened. Apollon told him about Voldemort, she said the name without flinching, and Harry noted that, about the war, the prophecy she knew only in fragments, about Lily and James Potter who had died not in a car crash but fighting, and about the scar that meant Harry had survived something no one had ever survived before. Harry listened. He didn't cry. He'd learned early that crying cost more than it was worth when no one was going to comfort you anyway. But he sat very still in the way that means a person is experiencing something large and quiet and seismic and is choosing not to disturb it. When she finished, the room was quiet. "Dumbledore put me at my aunt's house," Harry said. It wasn't a question this time either. "Yes. I believe so. So he knows what it's like." "That," Apollon said, with a precision in her voice that Harry could feel like the edge of something, "is exactly the right question." Fleur had put her book down entirely. She was watching Harry with an expression that was now entirely undisguised, not pity, not fascination, but a sort of clear and steady regard, like a person who has decided something about you and isn't going to take it back. "What happens now?" Harry asked. "Now," Apollon said, "we take you home for the evening. With your uncle's permission, which we have." Her tone on those last 3 words was interesting, Harry thought. Dry and precise. "There is more that Madame Fontaine needs to assess, and I would like to do it somewhere that is not a government building." She paused. "And you should eat. When did you last eat?" Harry thought about it honestly. "This morning. But it wasn't much." Apollon Delacour said something in French that was short and quiet and that Harry didn't need to understand to understand. "Can I?" Harry asked, not please or I'd like to but the bare, uncertain "can I," which said a great deal about what asking for things had historically cost him. "Yes," Apollon said firmly. "You can." The Delacours were staying at a magical property in Hampshire that had been provided by the British Ministry as part of the diplomatic hospitality, a long stone house behind a layered set of wards that Harry felt as a mild pleasant pressure as they passed through them, like walking through warm water. The grounds were green and overgrown in a deliberate way, the kind of garden that had opinions about itself. Inside, the house was organized with the particular warm efficiency of people who travel often and know how to make spaces immediately inhabitable. Someone had arranged flowers on the kitchen table. There were books spread across the sitting room in stacks that suggested recent use rather than decoration. A large tabby cat regarded Harry from the top of a bookshelf with an expression of profound indifference. There was also a grandmother. She emerged from the direction of the kitchen as they came in, shorter than Apollon, older, with white silver hair and a face that had spent decades being beautiful and had settled into something more interesting. She was, unmistakably, more Veela than anyone else in the building. The quality of her presence was something Harry felt in the air before he could see her, like humidity before rain. She stopped when she saw him, and her eyes, silver, sharp, went immediately to somewhere in the region of his chest, or slightly behind it, or perhaps to something Harry couldn't see but that she apparently could. Then she smiled. It was the kind of smile that rewrites the history of a room. "Alors," she said softly, in French. "C'est Louis." "This is Grandmère Celeste," Fleur said, with the tone of someone making an introduction and slightly bracing for impact. "She is very, she says what she is thinking." "I see your soul, child," Celeste said to Harry, without preamble, still smiling. "It is battered. But it is magnificent. My granddaughter has excellent taste." "Grandmère," Fleur said, with considerable feeling. "What?" "It is a compliment." Celeste looked at her granddaughter with affection that was completely unrepentant. "The bond is real. It is perhaps the clearest I have seen in 60 years, and I have known 7 bonded pairs." She looked back at Harry. "You felt it?" "Yes," Harry said. "It frightens you?" He considered that honestly. "No." Her smile deepened. "Good. It should not. It is not a cage. It is," she searched for a word, "a recognition. The magic finds what it belongs with. It does not command, it does not control. It simply knows. What you choose to do about what it knows is your own matter." She looked at Fleur with an expression that contained both enormous love and a certain amount of grandmotherly amusement. "Both of you." Fleur made a sound that was not quite a word but was very definitely an opinion. Apollon had moved to the kitchen and was doing several things at once, speaking quietly to a house elf Harry hadn't noticed, looking at something on a sheet of parchment, and maintaining a parallel awareness of everything in the room that struck Harry as something she'd been doing for so long it was simply how she existed. She looked up. "Fleur, show Harry where he can clean up. Dinner in 20 minutes. Fleur looked at Harry with the expression of someone who has accepted a task and has opinions about how it was assigned to them. "Come," she said, and led him upstairs. The upstairs hallway was narrow and the floorboards creaked and there were framed photographs on the wall that moved, people in robes waving at him, some of them with the silver blonde hair of the Delacour family, some of them clearly French and unfamiliar. Harry looked at every one as he passed. Fleur showed him the bathroom and handed him a folded towel and then stood in the hallway looking like she wanted to say something and was deciding how. "You are not afraid of any of it," she said finally. "The bond, what Maman told you, any of it." "Why not?" Harry thought about that. "I'm not sure," he said. "I think because it's real. Real things, you can deal with real things. It's the things people won't tell you that are scary." Fleur looked at him for a moment. "You are 7. You keep saying that. It is extraordinary. Is that bad or good?" She tilted her head slightly, and for just a second the studied composure of an 11-year-old who is very conscious of her dignity slipped, and underneath it was just a girl who'd had an extraordinary afternoon and was trying to make sense of it. "I don't know yet," she said, which was exactly what she'd said in the atrium, and this time it felt like an answer rather than an evasion. Harry nodded and went into the bathroom and looked at himself in the mirror, messy black hair, green eyes, bony face with the scar a pink mark above his eyebrow, and thought about everything he'd learned in the last 4 hours. His parents hadn't died in a car crash. His magic was dammed up and cracking. Someone had been watching him his whole life. He was apparently bonded to a quarter Veela girl who had opinions about his age and the most vivid quality of anyone he'd ever seen. And he was going to eat dinner. He washed his face and hands with the efficiency of someone who's never had the luxury of being slow about it and went back downstairs. Dinner was loud in the way of French families who consider speaking over each other a conversational technique rather than a problem. Celeste and Apollon conducted at least 3 separate threads of discussion simultaneously in French while a slightly younger woman Harry didn't know, introduced as a cousin, Isabelle, who worked for the French ministry's legal division and had apparently just arrived, contributed to all 3 threads at once with the energy of someone running on strong coffee and strong opinions. And in the middle of it, Harry ate. He ate the way he'd learned to eat when food was available and its availability was not guaranteed, efficiently, without drawing attention to the fact that he was on his second helping before most people had finished their first. He'd learned to do this unobtrusively, but Apollon noticed. He could see her notice without making it an event, which he appreciated. The food was extraordinary. He didn't have the words for what it was, rich and warm and complicated in ways that made a person realize, suddenly and uncomfortably, what food could taste like when it was made by someone who considered it worth making properly. Fleur, across the table, had apparently decided that the best approach to the afternoon's events was to return to her natural personality, which involved correcting her cousin's legal citation about something called the Accord de Lyon with specific and slightly imperious precision and then immediately asking Harry what Hogwarts taught in its first year, since she'd be going to Beauxbatons and had heard British magical education was not as advanced. "I don't know yet," Harry said. "I haven't been yet." "You should come to Beauxbatons instead," she said, with the air of someone pointing out the obvious. "It is better." "Fleur," Apollon said. "What?" "It is. You have never been to Hogwarts." "I have read about both schools. It is clearly better." She looked at Harry. "Do you want to go to Hogwarts?" "I haven't thought about it much," Harry said honestly. "I only found out magic was real properly about 6 months ago. I've been sort of, catching up." The table went slightly quieter than it had been. It was the quietness of people absorbing information and deciding what to do with it. "What did you think it was, before?" Fleur asked. There was no mockery in it. Pure curiosity. Accidents, Harry said. I thought I was just bad at controlling things. My aunt and uncle said I was abnormal. I thought maybe that was what abnormal meant. He said it matter-of-factly, the way you report weather. Something moved across Fleur's face. Something quick and complicated that she didn't try very hard to hide. Abnormal, she repeated. Yes. You, she said, who lit up my Veela magic from across a government atrium at 7 years old. She shook her head slightly. The audacity of ordinary people. Harry found, to his own surprise, that he laughed. It was a small laugh, and a bit rusty, and it surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise the people around him, but it was genuine, which was not something he could say about laughter with great frequency. Celeste, across the table, made a small approving sound. Albus Delacour turned away, but his shoulders moved. Apollon looked at Harry with that expression again, the one that had looked at his situation full in the face and decided it was going to be a problem she solved. She had a small glass of wine in her hand and she turned it once and set it down and looked at her husband. Apollon, she said, quietly, in English. A deliberate choice. For Harry's benefit. I know, he said. We will need Isabel. Obviously. And we should contact Mathieu about the Veela charter provisions. If the bond is verified, and it is verified, I saw it myself, then it creates obligations. Obligations which someone in Britain appears to have been violating by keeping the boy in those conditions for those years. Maman, Fleur said carefully, what are you saying? I'm saying, Apollon said, with the careful precision of someone filing down a statement until it's exactly the right shape, that Albus Dumbledore made a decision about Harry's life without legal authority to make it, in conditions that violate 3 separate provisions of the International Statute of Wizarding Welfare, and while a Veela bond was active, even partially, which creates additional standing under the Accord de Lyon that your cousin was incorrectly citing 20 minutes ago. Isabel looked briefly insulted, then thoughtful. He is Dumbledore, Apollon said. Not as an argument. More as a weather report. Here is the condition you'll need to navigate. He is also, Apollon said pleasantly, wrong. Which is a distinction that courts have not yet repealed. Harry sat in his seat with his third helping of something that was probably a French take on chicken and listened to the Delacour family begin, with the particular organized efficiency of people who are very good at things, to decide to set his world on fire on his behalf. He thought about asking if he should be more involved in the decision. He thought about all the ways this could go badly. He thought about the kitchen sink, and the roof, and the cupboard under the stairs, and his parents who hadn't died in a car crash. What happens to me? He asked, during a pause. Apollon looked at him directly. You stay here tonight. Tomorrow, Madame Fontaine finishes her assessment. And then we begin. Begin what exactly? Getting you out, she said simply. Harry put down his fork. He picked it up again. He ate the rest of his food, and the room was warm, and the conversation continued around him like a current, and Fleur kicked him lightly under the table when she thought he looked like he was getting stuck in his head, which startled him out of it, and he looked at her, and she raised an eyebrow at him with the expression of someone who has decided to keep doing that whenever necessary. Outside, it was getting dark over the Hampshire countryside. The atrium would be closing its banners and clearing its bunting. Vernon would be in Surrey explaining something to Petunia that he didn't fully understand. And Harry Potter sat at a table where someone had made the food worth tasting, and began, in small and careful increments, to believe that the warmth in his sternum might be allowed to stay. Chapter 2, What the diagnostician found. Madame Fontaine arrived at 7 in the morning with a leather case that clinked when she set it on the kitchen table and the particular focused energy of someone who had been thinking about a problem all night and had arrived at conclusions she wasn't entirely comfortable with. She accepted the coffee Apollon offered, drank half of it standing up, and then looked at Harry over the rim of the cup with the clinical directness of a healer who has learned that softening things doesn't actually make them easier. Did you sleep? She asked him. Yes, Harry said, which was true and also remarkable, because the guest room upstairs had a bed with an actual mattress and 2 pillows and a duvet that was neither too thin nor borrowed from someone else's discard pile, and Harry had fallen asleep within minutes of lying down and not woken until Apollon knocked on the door at 6:30. He'd lain there for a moment after she knocked, trying to figure out why everything felt different, and had eventually identified it as the absence of the specific low-grade alertness he normally maintained in sleep, the part of him that was always listening for the door, for footsteps, for the particular quality of silence that meant something was about to go wrong. Here, that part of him had simply stopped. Which was strange and good and slightly bewildering. Good. Madame Fontaine set down her cup and opened the case. I want to finish what I started yesterday. It will take longer this time. You need to sit still and not try to intervene when you feel the diagnostic spells. Some of them will feel strange. Don't resist them. All right, Harry said. Apollon sat at the other end of the table with a cup of tea and a sheaf of parchment, reading and not watching with the particular skill of a parent who is doing both. Apollon had left early, something to do with the French Ministry's liaison office in London, something Isabel had requested before she'd gone to bed last night with 3 books under her arm and the look of someone with research to do. Celeste was in the garden. Fleur was presumably still asleep, which at 11 and on what was technically still a diplomatic holiday seemed reasonable. Madame Fontaine began. The first set of spells were simple, the light anthread constructions from yesterday, expanded and more detailed. Harry watched the golden skeleton of his own magical core hang in the air and tried to stay still while Fontaine walked around it slowly with her wand-tip tracing patterns, murmuring diagnostic incantations in French that had the rhythm of something very old. The construct shifted and reconfigured as she worked, throwing off details in the form of color variations and structural anomalies that she noted on a self-writing parchment hovering at her shoulder. The second set felt different. It started as a pressure at the base of his skull, not painful, but definite, and moved slowly forward through his awareness the way someone moves through a room in the dark, careful and deliberate. Harry sat with it and didn't flinch, though it took some effort. It felt like being read. Not his thoughts, his history. He had the sense of something being unspooled, measured, its length assessed and its condition catalogued. The self-writing parchment filled 2 pages. Then 3. Fontaine stopped, looked at what she'd written, and was quiet for long enough that Apollon stopped pretending to read her own documents. How bad? Apollon asked, in French. Harry had gathered more French in the last 18 hours than he'd learned in his entire life on Privet Drive, which had been none. But Tone crossed languages easily. Translate, he said. Not rudely. Just directly. Fontaine looked at him, then at Apollon, who gave the same small nod as yesterday. Your magical core, Fontaine said carefully, is exceptional. I want to say that first because everything else I'm going to tell you should be understood in that context. You are 7 years old and your magical capacity is at the outer range of what I have seen in adults. Not in children, in adults. The potential here is considerable. But? Harry said. But it has been under suppression conditions since early childhood. I can see the markers clearly, stress responses, fear responses, repeated instances of accidental magic followed by what I can only describe as punishment events that your core registered and began to compensate for. She paused. Your magic learned to hide. Not because it was weak, but because expressing itself had consequences. So it developed patterns. Workarounds. Ways of being present without being visible. She tapped the golden construct, which was still hanging in the air. This structure here, do you see how it curves inward? A healthy core at your age expands naturally. Yours folds back on itself. It has been doing that for at least 4 years. Harry looked at the golden architecture of his own magic, at the places where it curved inward, and thought about what 4 years before now looked like. 3 years old. The time before he'd understood that the strange things that happened around him were his fault. Before he'd started trying not to let them happen. There's something else, Fontaine said. She moved her wand and the golden construct shifted, highlighting a section that pulsed slightly differently from the rest, a faint, complex pattern woven into the deepest layer of the structure. Here. Do you know what this is? She was asking Apollon now. Apollon stood and came to look. I've seen that before, Apollon said slowly. Once. In a case I read about. That looks like, she stopped. A monitoring charm, Fontaine said. A deep one. Woven into the core itself, not attached to the surface. This is not a ministry tracking charm, those are much simpler. This is artisan work. Specific, intentional. This is someone saying I want to know everything this magic does, all the time, and I want it to be invisible. The kitchen was very quiet. How old? Apollon asked. The weaving? As old as the scar. Fontaine looked at Harry. Someone placed this when you were 15 months old. Harry sat with that. 15 months old. Someone had looked at a baby who just survived something unsurvivable, and decided the first order of business was to wire him for surveillance. He didn't know exactly what to feel about that, so he filed it carefully in the part of his mind where things waited until he had time to properly deal with them. Does it transmit both ways? Apollon asked. No. One-directional. Outward only. Whoever placed it receives information. They send nothing back. Fontaine paused. Which means whoever it is knows about yesterday's diagnostic. They know about the bond. They know he's here. Then we don't have much time before, Apollon began. The front door opened. Everyone at the table went still, and then Isabel walked in with her arms full of books and a scrolled parchment under each arm and the bright-eyed focus of someone who has been up since 5 working and is running on discovery rather than sleep. She stopped when she registered the atmosphere. More actions right the next chapter now. Isabel stopped when she registered the atmosphere in the kitchen, the diagnostic construct still hanging in the air, Fontaine's expression, Apollon's stillness, and she dropped everything she was carrying on the nearest chair and said, I found it. The full legal framework. Tell me what you found first and then I'll tell you what we can do about it. The monitoring charm, Apollon said. Isabel's eyes went to Harry, then back. Deep set. Core level. Since infancy. Isabel said something in French that was short and sharp, and that Celeste, coming in from the garden at that exact moment with dirt on her hands and a serene expression, repeated with considerably more feeling. It also means, Fontaine said, still looking at her parchment, that the person monitoring knows his exact magical state at all times. They knew about the dam. They knew it was cracking. They've been watching it build for years and they have not intervened. They knew and left him there anyway, Apollon said. He'd come back. Harry hadn't heard him arrive, and was standing in the kitchen doorway with his coat still on and a look on his face that Harry was beginning to understand was his version of fury, very quiet, very flat, very dangerous. Yes, Fontaine said. Apollon looked at Harry. Then he crossed the kitchen, pulled out a chair, and sat down across from him. This was a thing Harry noticed about Albus Delacour, he moved toward things rather than around them. You understand all of this? He asked. Most of it, Harry said. How do you feel? It was such a direct question that Harry almost didn't know what to do with it. Angry, he said, after a moment. But sort of, cold angry. Not the kind where you break things. Apollon held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, the way you nod at something that's correct. Good, he said. That kind is useful. We're going to use it. Fleur appeared in the kitchen doorway in her dressing gown with her hair loose and a look on her face that said she had heard enough from the stairs to have context and was not going back to bed. She looked at the diagnostic construct, at Isabel's stack of books, at her father's coat still on, at Harry, and said, What did I miss? Sit down, Apollon said. We'll go through it once, together. So they did. Isabel laid it out on the kitchen table in the organized way of a legal mind that has been sorting information all night and is ready to present. She had 3 categories of documentation. She'd actually written them on separate parchments with headers, which Harry found satisfying, and she went through them with the methodical energy of someone who enjoys the architecture of an argument. The first category was the Veela bond provisions under the Accord de Lyon, which was a bilateral agreement between the French and British magical governments from 1893 that governed, among other things, the legal rights and protections afforded to Veela bonded individuals. The relevant section, Isabelle had bookmarked it with a small blue ribbon, stated clearly that a verified Veela bond created immediate and legally enforceable welfare obligations toward both bonded parties, regardless of nationality, and that any guardian arrangement that placed a bonded individual in conditions detrimental to their well-being was subject to review and challenge by the bonded party's family. The bond is partial, Apollon said. Does that affect standing? I spent 4 hours on that question, Isabelle said. No. The Accord doesn't distinguish between partial and complete bonds. Any verified bond creates standing. And, she produced a second parchment. There's a 1952 case, Beaumont versus the British Ministry, where a partial Veela bond was upheld as sufficient grounds for a custody challenge. We have direct precedent. The second category was the International Statute of Wizarding Welfare, 5 pages of highlighted passages, which Harry looked at and absorbed the key points of with the efficiency of someone who had learned that the fastest way to understand a situation was to find out what the rules were supposed to be and compare them to what was actually happening. The welfare statute required regular ministry check-ins for minors placed in non-magical guardianship. It required documented evidence of adequate nutrition and medical care. It required that a minor's magical development be monitored and supported. It required, in cases where the minor in question was a public figure, which the boy who lived indisputably was, additional oversight from a designated wizarding welfare officer. None of this had happened. Not once. Apollon asked. Not one documented visit, Isabelle confirmed. I pulled the records from the British Ministry's Welfare Division this morning. There's an initial placement notation from November 1981, signed by Albus Dumbledore as de facto magical guardian. Then nothing. 7 years of nothing. He signed himself as magical guardian. Apollon's voice was level and precise in the way of something that is not actually level. As de facto. Not legally appointed. The formal appointment process was never completed. He placed the child and then, didn't follow through with the paperwork. Which is either extraordinary negligence or a deliberate choice to keep the arrangement off the official record. Deliberate, Celeste said, from her chair in the corner where she'd been listening with her hands folded and her eyes sharp. That man does nothing by accident. The third category was what Isabelle called, with a lawyer's gift for understatement, the aggravating factors. The monitoring charm. The evidence of prolonged nutritional deprivation. The psychological markers that Fontaine had documented. The systematic suppression of magical development. Each one was a problem on its own. Together, they built something that Isabelle, very carefully and with the particular restraint of someone who knows exactly how much weight a phrase can carry, called a pattern of deliberate harm through inaction. That's not negligence language, Apollon said. No, Isabelle agreed. It isn't. Harry had been listening to all of this and following it, and now he said, what does this mean in practice? What can you actually do? Isabelle looked at him. She had the quality of someone who respects directness because they practice it themselves. We can file a Veela bond declaration with both the French and British ministries simultaneously. Once that's filed and verified, it creates immediate legal obligations that the British ministry has to respond to. They can't ignore it because the French ministry has co-filed it, and there are diplomatic dimensions that make ignoring it politically expensive. That forces a formal review of your guardianship arrangement. And Dumbledore? Once the review is opened, the placement he made in 1981 comes under scrutiny. The lack of proper legal appointment, the absence of welfare checks, the monitoring charm, all of it becomes part of the record. We can file a formal complaint against him personally with the Wiesengemot's Oversight Committee. Will it work? Harry asked. Isabelle paused for exactly 1 second. The legal framework is solid, she said. The precedents are in our favor. The evidence Madame Fontaine has documented is compelling. Another pause. What I cannot tell you is how much the British wizarding establishment wants to protect Albus Dumbledore. He is not just a man with a position. He is an institution. And institutions, she tilted her head slightly, have a gravity of their own. Isabel, Apollon said. I'm being honest. He should know what we're walking into. I know, Harry said. Do it anyway. Something in the room shifted slightly. It was subtle, the way a room shifts when a decision has been made that everyone present recognizes as real rather than provisional. Do it anyway, Apollon agreed, and reached for her quill. They spent the morning working. Harry was not excluded from this. Apollon, seemingly on instinct or principle or both, pulled a chair up to the main table and included him in every discussion that concerned him, explaining things he didn't know and moving on without condescension when he nodded. He was 7 and had spent 7 years operating with incomplete information in a system that made decisions over his head, and the experience of being included, simply, practically, as though his understanding mattered to the outcome, which it did, was something he registered with a quiet intensity that he didn't put into words. He learned, that morning, things he filed away with the efficiency of a person who has always known that information is a resource, the structure of the Wisengamot, how the oversight committee worked, what standing meant legally and practically, what a Veela bond declaration would look like once filed and what it would require in terms of verification. He learned that the French ministry operated with a civil law framework that made it more receptive to this kind of challenge than the British common law system. He learned that Isabel had 3 contacts in the British ministry's legal division who were not Dumbledore loyalists, and that this was rarer than it should have been. He also, during a break when Apollon and Isabel were in the sitting room going through precedent cases, learned from Fleur what Beauxbatons was actually like. They were sitting in the garden. Fleur had declared that she needed air, which seemed to mean she needed to not be in the room where legal documents were proliferating. The garden was wet with morning dew and very green, and Fleur sat on a stone bench with her legs folded under her and described her school with the combination of affection and critical assessment of someone who loves a thing and sees it clearly. The grounds are extraordinary, she said. The palace is in the Alps, real mountains, not this. She gestured at the pleasant Hampshire hills with a politeness that only barely concealed her opinion of them. The classes are rigorous. Much more rigorous than what I've read about Hogwarts. But there is also, a culture there. She paused. Of a certain kind of excellence that is also a certain kind of narrow. If you are beautiful, if you are powerful, if you are the right kind of impressive, you are celebrated. If you are different, she turned a fallen leaf over with one finger, you are merely tolerated. Which are you? Harry asked. She looked at him with the faint surprise of someone not expecting the question to come back that way. Both, she said. I am obviously, a gesture at herself that was neither vain nor embarrassed, simply factual, Veela. So I am considered beautiful by most people who see me. And I am academically strong. So I am celebrated. But I am also only a quarter Veela, which to some people means I am not fully human and to others means I am not fully magical. And the bond, a brief tightening around her eyes, when Grandmere told me I might have a bond, most of the girls at school thought it was romantic. Like a story. They did not understand that it is also, complicated. Real things usually are. How is it complicated for you? Harry asked. Genuinely, not to pry. Fleur considered the question seriously. I am 11 years old, she said. I have a bond with a 7-year-old boy I have never met, whose situation is, she paused, looking for the word, serious. I did not choose it. Neither did you. The Veela magic chose, and we are both now, affected. What I find complicated is the question of choice. If I had met you and decided, yes, I want this person in my life, it would feel different. But the magic decided first, and now I must decide whether I agree. She looked at him directly. Does that make sense? Yes, Harry said. That makes complete sense. And you? She asked. You don't seem bothered by it. I'm bothered by plenty of things, he said honestly. But the bond, he touched his sternum, the place where the warmth still sat, steady and quiet, it hasn't asked me to do anything. It hasn't hurt me. It hasn't made anything worse. In a list of things currently bothering me, it is very near the bottom. Fleur looked at him for a long moment with her clear grey eyes, and something in her expression settled, not decided, but considering. That is a practical way of thinking about it, she said. I live practically, Harry said. I didn't have much choice. A beat. Then Fleur asked, what is Privet Drive like? Harry thought about how to answer that honestly and concisely. Grey, he said. Very tidy. The kind of tidy where tidiness is a way of making sure nothing unusual happens. My uncle has a drill company. My aunt keeps the house perfect. My cousin has more toys than he can count. And I live in the cupboard under the stairs. Fleur went very still. The cupboard. Yes. Not, she started. Not a bedroom, no. She was quiet for a moment. He could see her processing it the way people process information that doesn't fit their existing picture of how the world works, the slight recalibration behind her eyes, the effort to accommodate a reality that was smaller and harder than she'd been imagining. And they knew, she said. The magical world. They left you there knowing. Your mother thinks Dumbledore knew. The monitoring charm thinks Dumbledore knew. Harry paused. I think Dumbledore had reasons that seemed good enough to him. That is extraordinarily generous, Fleur said. It's not generous. It's just, I think he's a person who is very good at deciding that the ends justify the means and then not examining the means too closely. Harry looked at the Hampshire hills. I think he decided I needed to be kept somewhere safe and hidden and that the shape of my life there was secondary to the strategic value of the placement. And I think that decision made sense to him because it was never his life that would be shaped by it. Fleur stared at him for a long moment. You are 7 years old, she said, for the third time, but now it sounded different, not disbelieving, but something more like someone repeatedly reminding themselves of a fact because it keeps surprising them. I've had a lot of time to think, Harry said. She almost smiled. He was learning the signs, a slight softening at the corners of her mouth, a brightness in her eyes that she controlled but didn't entirely conceal. You're magic, she said. What does it feel like? From the inside? No one had ever asked him that. He sat with the question. Compressed, he said. Like, you know when you put your hand over a torch to block the light? And the light is still there, you can see it through your fingers, but it's contained. It feels like that, mostly. Like something that's always pressing against the inside of whatever's holding it. He paused. Yesterday when the bond clicked, it didn't feel compressed anymore. Just for a moment. It felt like, the hand came off the torch. Fleur looked at him with an expression he couldn't name. Something serious and quiet that didn't need to be spoken. She turned the leaf over again. I felt it too, she said softly. From the outside. Your magic reaching, it felt like standing in sunlight when you didn't realize you were cold. They sat in the dew-wet garden in the morning quiet and didn't say anything for a while, and it wasn't uncomfortable. That was another thing Harry noticed and filed, sitting with someone in silence and having it be all right. He had been alone his whole life, but this was different from alone. This was someone else's silence choosing to exist next to his. Celeste appeared at the garden door and looked at them both with the expression of a woman who has lived long enough to find certain moments very satisfying. She said nothing, which was extraordinarily unlike her, and went back inside. Madame Fontaine returned to her diagnostic in the early afternoon, after lunch, another extraordinary meal that Harry ate with the same focused appreciation as the night before, and that Apollon watched with the same careful non-attention. Fontaine had a new set of diagnostic tools, smaller, more precise, and she spent an hour doing nothing but mapping the monitoring charm in detail, her wand moving in tiny careful strokes while the self-writing parchment filled with technical notation that Harry couldn't read but that made Isabel, looking over her shoulder, go very quiet. "Can it be removed?" Apollon asked, when Fontaine stepped back. "Yes. It's not malicious by design, it doesn't harm him. It observes. Removing it would require careful work, perhaps 2 hours, and I'd want to stabilize the core first before touching anything woven that deeply." "And the dam?" Harry asked. He'd been thinking about that word all morning, the image of his own magic folded inward, compressed, the river held back. The inward curving. "Can that be fixed?" Fontaine looked at him with the slightly different attention of someone who has been thinking about the same question. "Not fixed in the way you fix a broken bone," she said. "Your magic doesn't need to be repaired. It needs to be expressed. The inward curve is a learned response, your core learned to fold itself because every time it opened, there were consequences. The way to undo that learning is to let it open, consistently, in safety, without consequences." She paused. "Training, in other words. But training in an environment where magic is welcomed rather than punished." "Beaux batons," Fleur said, from across the room, without looking up from her book. She said it like it was obvious and also like she'd been waiting for a natural opening to say it. "You'd be doing that regardless," Harry told her. "It accommodates younger students in exceptional circumstances. There is a foundation program for magically advanced children who are placed in early admission." She looked up. "Grandmere went at 9. There is precedent." "We're getting ahead of ourselves," Apollon said, but with the tone of someone who is absolutely thinking about it. Fontaine cleared her throat. "There is one more thing I need to tell you. About the scar." The room's attention consolidated. "I ran deep diagnostics this morning," Fontaine said. "More detailed than last night. There is something in the scar that is not Harry's own magic." She set down her wand carefully, the gesture of someone making sure their hands are steady. "I don't know exactly what it is. I've never seen anything quite like it. But it is a second magical signature embedded in the scar tissue. Faint. Old. Dormant, for now." "Dormant meaning it could become active?" Apollon asked. "I don't know. I cannot tell what would activate it. But I would strongly recommend that any specialist who works with Harry's magic is aware of it and works around it carefully." She looked at Harry with an expression that was professional and also, underneath it, something like maternal worry, which she probably hadn't planned. "It is not hurting you," she said. "It has not been hurting you. But it is there, and it is, not yours." Harry thought about Voldemort. He thought about the night described to him yesterday, a house in Godric's Hollow, a curse that should have killed him and didn't. He thought about the way the scar sometimes burned when he was frightened or in pain, a fact he'd never mentioned to the Dursleys because mentioning pain to the Dursleys was generally unproductive. "It's him, isn't it?" he said. "Voldemort. A piece of him." The room didn't go quiet this time because the room had already been fairly quiet. But the quality of the attention in it changed. "That is my suspicion," Fontaine said carefully. "But I want a second opinion before I state it definitively. There is a specialist in Lyon who has studied the Dark Lord's magic. I'd like to send her my diagnostic notes." "Do it," Apollon said immediately. Then she looked at Harry, and for just a moment, the cool strategic precision that had been driving her all morning was displaced by something simpler and less managed. She looked at him the way she'd looked at her daughter when Fleur had been explaining the complications of the bond, with a fierce and immediate protectiveness that didn't ask for permission. "We're going to deal with all of this," she said. "One thing at a time. But we are going to deal with it." "I know," Harry said. He did know. That was the remarkable thing, sitting in this house with these people, with the evidence of his entire compromised situation laid out on the kitchen table in parchment and golden light and legal categories, he had more certainty than he'd had in his entire life. Not because everything was fine. Everything was spectacularly not fine. But because the people who were going to do something about it were not the kind of people who said they would and then didn't. He could tell that just by watching them. "The bond," Celeste said, from her corner. Everyone looked at her. She had been quiet for some time, and when she spoke the room reorganized itself to listen. "When I mapped it this morning," from Fleur's side, she looked at her granddaughter, who nodded almost imperceptibly, "it is holding steady. The partial bond in a child Fleur's age should be fragile. It should need careful management. This one is," she searched for the word again with the same care as yesterday, "certain. It has chosen, and it is not uncertain about its choice. I have not seen a bond with this quality of certainty in 60 years, and the last time I saw it was a pair who moved mountains together." She looked at Harry. "Your magic recognizes hers. Hers recognized yours across a room from 15 feet before you had any idea she existed. That is not common. That is not even rare. That is, singular." "What does that mean practically?" Fleur asked, with the tone of someone trying very hard to be sensible about something that is making that difficult. "Practically? It means that if you are in danger, Harry's magic will know from a distance. It means that your Veela ability will be amplified in his presence and diminished in his prolonged absence. It means that the more his magic is freed from its current constraints," Celeste gestured at the diagnostic materials, "at all of Fontaine's documentation, the more the bond will stabilize and the less both of you will feel its absence as a pressure." She paused. "And it means that anyone who deliberately separates you after a verified bond is filed as committing a violation that has historically been considered unkind. By people who have the power to do something about it." "Dumbledore," Fleur said. "Not yet," Isabel said, looking up from her parchments. "He doesn't know about the bond yet. He knows about yesterday's diagnostic, the monitoring charm. But the bond itself is something we control the timing on. We file the declaration when we are ready, not before." She tapped her pen on the table. "And we're almost ready. I need 2 more days to have the filing properly prepared. I want to make sure it is bulletproof." "Then we have 2 days," Apollon said. "Fontaine, begin the core stabilization today. By tomorrow, start the removal of the monitoring charm." A pause. "Let him know we found it. Let him wonder what we intend to do." "You want him to know we know?" Apollon asked. "I want him to know we are not afraid of him," Apollon said, with a simplicity that was slightly extraordinary. "Because we're not." That evening, after dinner, Harry found himself in the sitting room with Celeste, who had a deck of cards, ordinary Muggle playing cards, he noticed, and was doing something complicated with them that might have been a card game or might have been something else entirely. "Sit," she said, without looking up. He sat. She played out 3 cards and looked at them and then set the deck down and looked at him with her sharp silver eyes. "Ask me something," she said. "The thing you haven't asked anyone else today." Harry looked at her. She looked back with the patient certainty of someone who knows the question is there and is happy to wait. "The piece of him," Harry said. "In the scar. If it's real, if it's a piece of Voldemort, then what am I? What does that make me?" Celeste was quiet for a moment. Not thinking about the answer, she'd known it before he asked, he suspected. She was deciding how to say it. "It makes you someone who carries something unwanted," she said. "It makes you someone who did not choose what lives in you, and who has lived with it regardless, and who has not been diminished by it." She met his eyes. "What it does not make you is 2 people. You are Harry Potter, and you have been Harry Potter every moment of your life, even when carrying this thing. The passenger does not become the driver. It is in you. You are not in it." Harry let that settle. "But it might need to be removed eventually." "Perhaps. And that might hurt." "Perhaps." She didn't soften it. "But you have already lived through 7 years of things that should have been impossible for a child to live through, and you have arrived here," she gestured at the sitting room, at himself, "intact. Angry. Curious. Warm inside, in the way that matters. A passenger cannot reach all the way through a person's soul and take that away. Harry looked at the playing cards on the table. 3 of them, king, queen, and a 7. He wondered if that was deliberate. With Celeste, he was beginning to suspect most things were. "Do you like her?" Celeste asked. Conversationally, as though asking about the weather. Harry looked up. "Fleur. My granddaughter, yes." "Yes," Harry said. Simply, because it was true. "She's honest. She says what she thinks. She doesn't talk to me like I'm a small thing." Celeste's smile was the same one from yesterday, the kind that rewrites the room. "She doesn't talk to most people like they are small things," she said. "It is one of her finest qualities and one of her greatest difficulties simultaneously." She picked up her cards and resumed whatever she was doing. "She likes you too. She has been thinking about it all day, which for Fleur means she is working out how she feels, because she does not allow herself to feel things before she understands them." A pause. "She will get there. She is very thorough." Harry almost smiled. He was doing that more than usual, the muscles required for it were getting exercise they weren't accustomed to. "Get some sleep," Celeste said, without looking up. "Tomorrow Fontaine begins releasing the dam, and your magic is going to have a great deal of catching up to do, and you should be rested for it." He stood to go, and then he stopped. "Thank you," he said. "For explaining the bond yesterday. For not making it feel like a trap." Celeste looked up at him and her expression was something he couldn't fully categorize, something warm and old and very certain. "It is not a trap," she said. "It is an opening. What you do with it is your own choice. That is the most important thing my mother taught me, and I have been teaching it to my family ever since." She nodded toward the door. "Sleep, child. Tomorrow you start becoming what you already are." He went upstairs. The floorboards creaked. The photographs waved. Through the door of Fleur's room he could see a sliver of lamplight, which meant she was still awake, probably reading, probably something that wasn't the book she'd been pretending to read all day. He went to his room. He lay down on the mattress that was exactly the right kind of soft. The warmth in his sternum was steady and unhurried, and the part of him that usually spent sleep listening for danger was quiet, and he thought briefly about rivers behind dams and passengers who were not drivers, and then he slept without dreaming. In the morning, Fontaine would begin. In 2 days, Isabel would file. Somewhere in London, a monitoring charm was transmitting its last full picture of a contained, suppressed, hidden boy living in a cupboard in Surrey, and the picture was already out of date, because that boy was in Hampshire sleeping in an actual bed in a house full of people who were spending their evenings doing research on his behalf. The dam had already begun, in small ways, to crack. Chapter 3, The Accord filed. The monitoring charm came out on a Tuesday morning at 9:47, and Harry felt it go like a splinter being drawn cleanly from skin, a brief sharp awareness, then a relief so sudden it was almost dizzying. He sat on the edge of the kitchen table where Fontaine had positioned him and breathed carefully while she completed the extraction with the focused precision of a surgeon removing something that had no business being where it was. The golden thread she drew out of his magical core was thin as spider silk and about 4 inches long. It sat on the glass plate she prepared for it and pulsed faintly, still transmitting, still reaching for wherever it had been reaching for 7 years. Everyone in the kitchen looked at it. "Leave it transmitting," Apollon said. "For now." Fontaine set the plate carefully to one side and turned back to Harry. "How do you feel?" "Different," Harry said. Because it was the only accurate word. The monitoring charm had been there his entire remembered life and he hadn't known it was there, which meant he had nothing to compare its absence to, except that the absence felt like a room suddenly having more air in it. Like something had been sitting just at the edge of his awareness and pressing, and now it wasn't. "Lighter," he added. "Good." Fontaine made a note. "Now the harder part." The core stabilization had been going since yesterday afternoon in careful incremental stages, Fontaine working for an hour at a time, then resting Harry for 2, then returning. What she was doing, as near as Harry could understand it, was coaxing the inward curve of his magic to release. Not forcing it. Not overriding the learned response. Showing it, repeatedly and patiently, that opening was safe. That nothing would happen when it reached outward except more reaching. It was strange to experience. The first session yesterday had produced a warmth in his chest that spread to his extremities and then subsided. The second session had produced a warmth that stayed. This morning's session produced something larger, a sort of deep resonance, like a bell struck at the bottom of a lake, that he felt in his bones rather than on the surface of his skin, and that came with a rushing sense of more that was slightly overwhelming and also the best thing he'd ever felt physically, which was not a high bar but was nonetheless remarkable. Something cracked open in him. Not dramatically. Not like a rupture. More like ice in spring, a deep structural shift, mostly quiet, with the occasional sound. A glass on the kitchen shelf rattled. The window above the sink fogged over. The 3 yellow tulips in the vase on the table turned, all at once, to face him. Fontaine took a step back and watched with an expression that was trying very hard to be clinical and wasn't quite managing it. "There," she said softly, to herself or to Apollon or to no one in particular. "There it is." Harry looked at the tulips, which were now quite firmly pointed at him, and felt the resonance settle slowly into something sustainable, large and warm and absolutely, undeniably present in a way it had never been before. He put one hand flat on the kitchen table and felt the grain of the wood, the slight imperfections in its surface, and somehow felt all of that with his magic as well as his fingers, an additional dimension of information that was simply there now, like a new sense that had been waiting for the door to open. "Extraordinary," Fontaine said, and this time she didn't try to make it clinical. Fleur was in the doorway. She had that look again, the one she'd worn in the garden, quiet and unguarded, the one that slipped past the composed 11-year-old dignity. The bond, Harry realized distantly, must feel different from her side right now. Like a string that had been slack and had suddenly become taut. She met his eyes and said nothing, which with Fleur meant more than most people's paragraphs. "How much of that was always there?" Harry asked Fontaine. "All of it," she said. "I told you the dam was holding a great deal of water. I was not exaggerating." She looked at him carefully. "We've opened the first gate, so to speak. There are more. We go slowly, opening everything at once would be inadvisable," Apollon said. "I was going to say unprecedented in a child this age," Fontaine said, "but inadvisable works too." "How long for all the gates?" Harry asked. "Months, done properly. This isn't something that resolves in a week. Your magic has been suppressed for most of your life, the patterns are deep. We can accelerate the process with consistent training and a supportive environment, but it takes time." She paused. "In the meantime, you should expect accidental expressions. More than usual. Your control will actually be worse before it's better, because the magic has been constrained for so long that it doesn't yet have the habit of moving voluntarily, it only knows how to burst." As if to illustrate this, the fog on the window rearranged itself into what appeared to be a small lightning bolt, held for 3 seconds, and then dissipated. Harry looked at it. "That was me. Unless anyone else in this kitchen is feeling particularly dramatic," Fontaine said. Apollon, who had been reading the morning edition of Le Monde Sorcier at the far end of the table, turned a page without looking up. "I thought it was well executed," he said. Isabel finished the declaration filing at noon. She brought it to the kitchen table in a folder, proper parchment, sealed with the Delacour family crest in blue wax, with a separate official copy bearing the preliminary verification stamp of the French Ministry's Magical Creatures and Beings Division, which handled Veela bond certifications. She laid it on the table and looked at Apollon with the expression of a person who has built something they're confident in. "Both simultaneous?" Apollon asked. "Both." Isabel tapped the 2 copies, one in the folder, one beside it. "The French Ministry copy goes to Paris via Secure Owl in 20 minutes. The British Ministry copy, she produced a third sealed envelope, goes to the DMLE directly. Not to the Department of Magical Cooperation. Not to Dumbledore's Hogwarts address. To Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, personally addressed. Why Bones? Apollon asked. Because she has a reputation for being the person in the British Ministry most likely to actually read something rather than file it. Isabel sat down. And because the complaint against Dumbledore goes in the same envelope. She can't claim she didn't see it. Will she move on it? Apollon asked. I genuinely don't know. But I know she won't bury it, which is more than I can say for anyone in the Department of Magical Cooperation. Isabel paused. There's something else. I contacted Mathieu last night about the Accord provisions. He flagged something I missed. The 1893 Accord has a supplementary clause, Article 14b, which was added in 1923 after the Margot case. It says that in the event of a verified Veela bond where one party is a minor in non-parental guardianship, the bonded party's family has the right to petition for interim custody of the other minor, pending formal resolution of any guardianship challenges. The kitchen went quiet. Interim custody, Apollon said. Meaning we can ask the British Ministry to grant us formal temporary guardianship of Harry while the challenge is resolved. It would get him out of Privet Drive legally and immediately, and it would give us the standing to make decisions about his medical care and education. Isabel looked at Harry. We'd need to ask you whether you want that. Harry had been following this with his full attention, the new warm largeness in his chest steady and present. He looked at Isabel. Then at Apollon. Then at the window where the lightning bolt had been. Yes, he said. Yes to interim custody, or yes you want to be asked. Isabel said, with a lawyer's precision. Both, Harry said. Isabel nodded and made a note. I'll add Article 14b to the filing. Do it before the owl goes, Apollon said. Isabel was already writing. Apollon looked at the table, at the filing, at the parchments, at 7 years of evidence laid out in legal architecture. Then she looked at the still transmitting monitoring thread on its glass plate, pulsing faintly across the kitchen. When does Dumbledore realize we filed? Harry asked. When the British Ministry owl arrives at Hogwarts, Apollon said. Which will happen tomorrow morning. Amelia Bones receives today, reads today if we're fortunate, and is required by statute to notify all parties named in a guardianship challenge within 24 hours. She looked at Harry steadily. He'll know by tomorrow afternoon at the latest. Possibly by tonight. What will he do? Come here, Apollon said, simply. He will want to manage it. That is what he does. He comes in person and he explains and he frames things in terms of the greater good and he is very convincing, and most people find themselves agreeing before they've understood exactly what they've agreed to. She picked up the monitoring thread in its glass plate and looked at it. We will not be meeting with him here. If he wants to discuss this, he discusses it in the British Ministry with Amelia Bones present. She set the plate down. And we leave the thread transmitting until the filing goes, because I want him to know we know about it, and I want him to spend tonight wondering what we intend to do next. Harry thought about that. About Dumbledore somewhere in Hogwarts, a castle full of magic that Harry had never seen, receiving a notification about a Veela bond and a guardianship challenge and an Article 14b petition and not knowing the monitoring charm had already been found. Wondering what else they knew. Wondering what was coming. Good, said something cold and clear in his chest, and it wasn't the warmth of the bond. It was something harder. I want to be there, Harry said. When you talk to him. I don't want to be in a room somewhere else while decisions about me are made. Apollon looked at him for a moment. I wasn't planning to exclude you, she said. I know. But I wanted to say it. She nodded once. Noted. The owl to the British Ministry went at 12:37. The owl to Paris went 2 minutes later. Isabel watched them both out the window until they were out of sight and then sat back down with the particular relief of someone who has just committed to something large and irreversible and has decided that's fine. Fleur found Harry in the garden at 2:30. He was standing near the back wall with his hands loose at his sides, and the garden was doing something interesting. The grass in a circle around him was very green, noticeably greener than the rest, and the flowers nearest to him had all opened fully despite the cloud cover, and there was a very faint hum in the air that wasn't quite sound so much as the physical sense of presence. Fleur stopped a few feet away and looked at the grass. "You've been out here for an hour," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm trying to feel where the edges are." "Of your magic?" "Yes. I couldn't before, it was all folded in. Now that it's starting to open, I'm trying to understand the shape of it." He looked at his hands. "It's like learning how big your hands are. You've had hands your whole life, but if they were wrapped up you wouldn't know their actual size until the wrapping came off." Fleur came to stand beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her, not just physically, but the Veela quality that was now much more apparent to him than it had been in the atrium, now that his own magic had more room to perceive things. She felt like the bond did, from the inside, like a specific quality of warmth and certainty that didn't demand anything of him. "What does it feel like?" she asked. "The actual magic. Now." He thought about how to describe it. "Like a fire in a room that was too small for it," he said. "Not out of control. But, aware of all the space suddenly." He paused. "And it goes toward you," he added, without looking at her. "When I stop directing it at anything specific, it goes toward you. A beat." "Mine does the same," she said, equally matter of fact, equally without looking at him. "It has since the atrium. It was somewhat inconvenient at first. Now it is," she paused, "less inconvenient." "High praise," Harry said. She turned to look at him with that almost smile. "Don't push it." He almost smiled back. The circle of green grass extended slightly outward. They stood in the garden for a while. A robin landed on the back wall and looked at Harry with its head tilted, apparently unbothered by the ambient magic. Fleur watched it with her arms crossed in their habitual position. "Tell me about your parents," she said. Harry looked at her. "You want to know?" "I want to know who they were. Not the story the magical world tells about them. Who they actually were." She glanced at him. "My mother looked them up last night. Lily and James Potter. Your mother was Muggle-born, top of her year at Hogwarts, exceptional in charms and potions. Your father was from an old wizarding family, reportedly arrogant as a young student, reportedly excellent at transfiguration. They were in the Order of the Phoenix." She paused. "But that's the record. That's not who they were to each other or what they were like to have around. I want to know that." "I don't know it," Harry said. A silence. "I know almost nothing about them," he said. "My aunt would barely mention them, and when she did it was always, they were wrong, they were abnormal, they made bad choices. I know my mother's eyes looked like mine, because a witch told me that once when she saw me in the street and started crying. I know my father could make a stag with his magic. I found that out from a book about magical records that I read in the school library when I was 6 and the teacher wasn't watching." He paused. "I know they died protecting me. That's most of what I have." Fleur was quiet for a moment. "When you get to school," she said, carefully, "there will be people who knew them. Teachers. People who were in the order with them. People who remember." She looked at him directly. "You should ask them. Don't let people tell you a legend. Make them tell you the person." Harry looked at her. "All right," he said. "I am serious." "I know. You're always serious." "I am not always," she stopped. "That is partially true. But it is a good kind of serious." "I didn't say it wasn't." She held his gaze for a moment with an expression that was partly annoyed and mostly not. Then she looked back at the garden. Come inside soon. My mother is going to want to go over the possible responses to the filing and she will want you present. I'll come in 10 minutes. 5. 10. 7.5. You cannot be serious about 7.5. I am always serious, she said, with a deliberate solemnity that was absolutely a joke, and walked back toward the house. Harry stood in the circle of green grass for approximately 8 minutes, which was a compromise he felt good about. By evening, nothing had come back from the British ministry. This was expected. Isabel had said today was for receiving, not responding, and the statute allowed 24 hours for notification. But there was a quality to the evening's silence that was different from the last 2 evenings, the particular silence of something in motion that hasn't yet arrived at the part where it makes noise. Apollon had received a call from his counterpart at the French ministry's liaison office, confirming the filing had been received and logged in Paris. Official. Time-stamped. Unretractable. The French ministry was formally a party to this now, which meant that any British attempt to simply disappear the complaint would have diplomatic dimensions. Have you eaten properly? Apollon asked Harry, while they were doing the washing up. She washed, he dried, which was a chore he was extraordinarily good at, having spent years doing it for the Desleys. She noticed this too, the way she noticed everything, but said nothing about it except to hand him the next bowl. Yes, he said. And you feel all right? After this morning's session? Yes. He dried the bowl. More than all right, honestly. The accidental expressions, have there been more? A few. Nothing dramatic. He paused. The tulips in my room rotated to face the window during the night. I think they're tracking the bond direction. Fleur's room is that way. He said it matter-of-factly, because it was a fact. Apollon was quiet for a beat, and then she handed him another bowl with a particular carefulness that might have been amusement carefully contained. Noted, she said. Later, Isabel cornered him in the hallway with the look of someone who had been thinking about something all day and had decided to say it now rather than wait. I want to talk to you about the hearing, she said. When it happens. Because it will happen, Bones will convene it, she has no choice, the statute requires it within 30 days of a formal bond declaration. All right, Harry said. You will need to testify. Your own account of your living conditions, your treatment, your magical development. She looked at him seriously. I know you're 7. The Wisengamot will know you're 7. And there will be people in that room who will look at you and see the boy who lived and want to protect their image of what that means. Other people will see a child and think a child's testimony is less credible than an adult's. And I want you to know that neither of those things are your problem to manage. Your only job is to tell the truth exactly as it was. Don't perform. Don't soften. Don't make it easier for them to hear. She held his gaze. Tell them what the cupboard was like. Tell them about the food. Tell them what it felt like when magic happened and the consequences followed. All of it. Harry looked at her. You think they'll try to dismiss me? Some will try. Some will be moved. Some will be somewhere in between and watching which way the room tilts. She paused. You are not a small thing, Harry. Your magic is not small, and what happened to you is not small, and the version of you that walks into that room and tells the truth simply and without flinching is going to be significant. I want you to understand that. He understood that. He also understood the thing underneath it, the thing Isabel was saying between the words, which was I've seen what you are and I'm telling you to trust it. Okay, he said. That's all. Just okay. I've been practicing not being afraid of things, he said. I think a room full of important people watching me is something I can be not afraid of. Isabel looked at him for a moment and then made a sound that was almost a laugh, short and surprised. Right, she said. Good. She went back to her parchments. The response came the next morning, and it came not by owl. It came by Patronus. They were all at breakfast when it arrived, a silver cat with unusual ears slipping through the front wall of the house with the particular immaterial ease of a Patronus in transit. It stopped in the middle of the kitchen, looked directly at Apollon with the uncanny awareness of a message carrier, and spoke in the brisk, no-nonsense voice of a woman who had clearly sent this the moment she read the filing. Madame Delacour. I have received and reviewed your submission in full. I am convening a preliminary hearing under Section 7 of the Guardianship Review Act within 14 days, not 30 as the statute allows. There are aspects of this matter which I consider urgent. You and your legal representative will be notified of the date formally by end of week. The Article 14b petition is under review and I will have a preliminary ruling on interim custody within 48 hours. I have also sent a notification to the party named in your complaint. Please be advised that the matter of the monitoring charm, specifically, has been escalated to my direct attention and will be handled under a separate provision that I will explain at the hearing. Amelia Bones, head of the DMLE. The Patronus dissolved. The kitchen was quiet for 3 seconds. 14 days, Apollon said. She read the whole thing last night, Isabel said, with something approaching respect. And she moved it from 30 days to 14 without being asked. The monitoring charm, Apollon said. She escalated it separately. She knows what that means. A deep-set monitoring charm on a minor without legal guardianship authority is criminal, not civil. She's separating the tracks. Smart, Isabel said. She's running the civil guardianship challenge and the criminal investigation of the charm on parallel tracks so that neither one can be used to slow down the other. She looked at her notes. That's, actually very smart. And it means she already suspects who placed the charm. Everyone in this room suspects who placed the charm, Celeste said, drinking her tea. Yes, but now the head of the DMLE suspects it in an official capacity, Isabel said, which is considerably more useful. Harry had been listening with both the conscious attention he always paid to things that concerned him and the new, wider open quality of his magic that was still learning how to exist in its larger form. He felt, not surprised, exactly. More like the feeling of watching a machine begin to move, seeing the parts engage, understanding that it was now running under its own momentum. He got his notification this morning, he said. Yes, Apollon said. How do you think he reacted? Apollon considered that honestly. I think he was very calm. I think he read it carefully and thought about it from several angles. I think he then made 3 or 4 decisions very quickly, and I think those decisions involved managing the situation rather than responding to it transparently. She paused. I think he is currently deciding whether to contact me directly or to work through channels. He will choose channels, he won't want to appear alarmed. He'll send someone who can feel out our position without committing him to anything. Who? Fleur asked. Someone trusted. Someone whose presence is an expression of confidence rather than urgency. Apollon set down her teacup. We'll probably know by this afternoon. She was right by about 4 hours. The owl arrived at 2 in the afternoon carrying a short note on Hogwarts letterhead, in handwriting that was careful and elegant and that Harry somehow knew was Dumbledore's before Apollon confirmed it, because it had the quality of something that had been composed over time rather than written in haste. Each word was exactly where it meant to be, which took effort to achieve and was meant to suggest the opposite. Dear Madame Delacour, I have received notification of the matter you have filed with the British Ministry, and I understand that there are concerns which you feel require formal address. I am, of course, fully willing to discuss any aspect of Harry's situation that troubles you. I have his well-being very much at heart, as I always have. I wonder if we might meet at your earliest convenience, in whatever setting would be most comfortable for you, to speak informally before the formal proceedings begin. I believe that a great deal of misunderstanding can be resolved through direct conversation between reasonable people. Yours with warmth and respect, Albus Dumbledore. Apollon read it twice. Then she handed it to Isabel without comment. Isabel read it and said, informal meeting to resolve misunderstandings before formal proceedings. He wants to talk us out of it. He wants to understand what we know before the hearing, Apollon corrected. The offer to talk is genuine enough, he will genuinely try to explain himself. But the function of the conversation would be intelligence gathering dressed as reasonableness. What do we write back? Isabel asked. We don't, Apollon said. We send an acknowledgement of receipt and refer him to the ministry hearing date when it's confirmed. She picked up her quill. If he wants to speak to me, he speaks to me at the ministry with Bones in the room. He'll take that as a hostile signal, Isabel said. Good, Apollon said pleasantly, and began writing. Harry looked at the letter on the table. He looked at Dumbledore's careful, composed handwriting, at Harry's well-being very much at heart, at reasonable people. He thought about the monitoring charm in its glass plate, pulsing faintly. He thought about the cupboard. He thought about Fontaine's diagnostic, the inward curve, years of water behind a dam. He reached out and picked up the letter, which surprised everyone including himself, and read it again from the beginning. Then he set it down. He's not a bad person, Harry said. I don't think he is. No, Apollon agreed, watching him. But he made a decision about what mattered and what didn't, and where I landed in that calculation, and he's been confident in that decision for 7 years. Harry looked at the letter. And now someone has challenged the calculation and he wants to explain it to us and have us understand, because he genuinely believes that if we understand it we'll agree with him. He paused. That's the most dangerous kind of wrong. The kind where the person is completely sincere. No one spoke for a moment. Then Apollon, at the end of the table, said, I have been trying to say that for 2 days and couldn't find the words. Apollon looked at her husband. I told you, she said simply. You told me he was extraordinary, yes. He looked at Harry with the same quality of directness he'd been directing at him since the first morning, the attention of someone who takes things seriously. The hearing is in 14 days. Between now and then, Fontaine continues her work on your core. Isabel prepares your testimony. And you, he paused, you continue doing what you've been doing, which is paying attention to everything. And training, Fontaine said, from where she'd been quietly finishing her coffee. I want to begin structured exercises tomorrow. Nothing complex, basic directed magic, wandless. Getting your core used to moving on purpose rather than by accident. She looked at Harry. The accidental expressions are going to increase as the gates open. I want you to have enough voluntary control that you can redirect them when you need to. All right, Harry said. He felt the warmth in his chest steady and present, the new largeness of his magic like a room he was still learning the dimensions of, the bond a quiet direction in the space toward Fleur's position in the house. He felt the monitoring thread on its glass plate still transmitting, and he felt the particular cold clarity of knowing that across London or wherever Dumbledore was, something had just become complicated in ways the careful handwriting had not revealed. Good, said that cold clarity again. Tomorrow, then, he said. That night, he couldn't sleep, and after an hour of lying in the exact right mattress with the warmth of the bond and the new expansiveness of his magic both present and somehow restless, he got up and went quietly downstairs. Fleur was already there. She was at the kitchen table with a mug of something hot and a book that this time she was actually reading, he could tell because she didn't look up when he came in, which was not Fleur performing inattention but Fleur genuinely absorbed. She registered his presence and the page turn continued without interruption. He made tea in the way he'd learned from watching Apollon, the French approach, which was different from the English approach and which produced something better. He sat across from Fleur with his tea and the comfortable quiet of the house around them. After a while she turned a page and said, without looking up, "You're thinking about the hearing." "Yes." "Are you worried?" He thought about it honestly. "No. I don't think so. I think he paused, anticipating it. The way you anticipate something you've been waiting for." She looked up at that. "You've been waiting for it?" "Not specifically. But I've been waiting for something to actually happen, for as long as I can remember. Something real, instead of just, enduring." He wrapped his hands around his mug. "This is real. The filing is real. The hearing is real. Even if things go wrong, at least things are actually happening. Fleur looked at him across the table. Outside, the Hampshire night was very quiet, the kind of quiet that rural English places achieved in the small hours with some commitment. Things won't go wrong, she said, and she said it with the particular quality of a person who says things when they are certain of them and doesn't say them when they aren't. Maman doesn't lose. Everyone loses sometimes, Harry said. My mother loses when the evidence is against her, Fleur said. The evidence is not against her. She turned another page. Drink your tea. Go back to sleep. You're not sleeping. I don't sleep well the night before important things. It is a character flaw I have made peace with. She looked up at him over the edge of her book. You, however, are in the middle of having your magical core restructured, which Fontaine said requires rest to consolidate properly. So you should sleep. Very well reasoned, Harry said. I am always well reasoned. Also a character flaw. She studied him for a moment. The almost smile. It can be. She returned to her book. Good night, Harry. He drank his tea. He went back upstairs. He lay down and this time the restlessness had quieted, and the bond was steady, and the new largeness of his magic was settling into something more like a natural state than a surprise, and outside the window there was a single star visible through a gap in the clouds. In 14 days, he'd walk into the Wisengamot. He closed his eyes and thought about Isabel saying tell them what the cupboard was like, and he thought about the cold clarity in his chest, and he thought about Fleur at the kitchen table with her book and her certainty, and he let all of that be what it was, and slept. Chapter 4. The hearing. The Ministry of Magic on a formal hearing day had a completely different quality from the ministry on a regular Wednesday afternoon. Harry felt at the moment the telephone box opened into the atrium, a compressed, charged atmosphere, like a room full of people who have strong opinions and are currently exercising restraint about them. Every witch and wizard they passed in the corridors seemed to know who they were, or at least who Harry was, and the awareness traveled ahead of them in ripples. Heads turned. Conversations paused. A wizard in lavender robes actually walked into a door. Harry kept walking. He was wearing proper clothes, robes that Apollon had procured 2 days ago from a French magical outfitter, deep blue, well-fitted, nothing that announced wealth but everything that said this child is accounted for. His hair was still impossible, which Apollon had looked at once and then looked away from with the expression of someone choosing their battles. He walked between Apollon and Apollon with Fleur a half-step behind and Isabel slightly ahead, and the shape of the group said something. It said together, and deliberately, and we know where we're going. Celeste had stayed at the house. I would make the room unusable, she'd said simply, and since a full-blooded Veela walking into an already charged legal proceeding was the kind of variable that nobody needed, everyone had agreed without discussion. Madame Fontaine had sent her full diagnostic report to Amelia Bones 3 days ago, 47 pages of precise medical and magical documentation with conclusions that were, as Isabel put it, a problem for anyone who wants to argue that Harry Potter was fine. The interim custody ruling had come through yesterday afternoon, 2 clipped paragraphs from Bones granting the Delacours temporary guardianship pending the hearing's outcome, on the basis that the Article 14b petition was facially valid and that the existing arrangement had insufficient documentation to rebut it. Apollon had countersigned. The Desleys had received a ministry notification that Harry's temporary care had been formally transferred, and Vernon had apparently called the ministry's Muggle liaison line, been put on hold for 20 minutes, and then rung off without speaking to anyone, which Isabel had reported with a satisfaction she didn't entirely conceal. Harry was no longer, technically or legally, the Desleys' problem. That had settled into him over the last 24 hours with a quiet, tectonic finality. No drama. No scene. Just a piece of paper that said the arrangement made by one person's decision 7 years ago has been interrupted by a different set of decisions, and the world had continued without collapsing, which he filed under proof that the situation was never as fixed as it was meant to appear. The hearing room was on the 9th floor, down a corridor that was spelled to muffle sound. Harry noticed the subtle change in acoustics as they turned the corner, the way voices carried differently. Two aurors in formal robes stood outside the chamber doors. They saw the group coming and neither of them moved to stop them, though one of them looked at Harry in the particular way that had the Scar's answer quality. Isabel pushed open the door. The Wisingamot courtroom was older looking than Harry had imagined. He'd imagined something impressive and formal but ultimately similar to a Muggle courtroom. This was different. The stone walls were ancient and the ceiling was high and the tiered seating curved in a horseshoe above the floor level, already half full with witches and wizards in plum-colored robes with silver trim. The chamber torches threw amber light across everything and there was a low murmur of conversation from the upper tiers that subsided when the Delacours entered. At the center of the floor level was a table, not a dock, a proper table with chairs, which Harry understood meant this was a hearing rather than a trial. Formal but not yet criminal, Isabel had explained. The civil track. At the head of the room, elevated slightly on a raised platform, a single chair that was clearly designated for the presiding officer was still empty. The other table, opposite theirs, was not. Albus Dumbledore was already seated. Harry had not seen him before except in photographs, a tall wizard with a long silver beard and half-moon spectacles, wearing robes of deep purple. In photographs he always looked like a man who was enjoying the picture being taken. In person he looked different, the same physical presence, the same quality of someone who occupies a room entirely, but the enjoyment was absent. In its place was something that Harry's newly unfolded magic registered as a complex layered thing, controlled calm on the surface, and underneath it, something that was not quite worry but was the sophisticated cousin of worry, the alert stillness of a very intelligent person in a situation they did not design and are currently assessing. Beside him sat a younger wizard with neat dark hair, Ministry Legal Counsel, Isabel had indicated from their prior intelligence, and a woman Harry didn't recognize who had an administrative quality about her, parchment and quill at the ready. Dumbledore's eyes found Harry immediately. Blue, famously, very blue, with the quality of depth that people talked about. They found Harry and stayed, and Harry looked back at him directly because he'd promised himself he would and because there was nothing in that gaze that required him to look away. For just a moment, something moved behind Dumbledore's expression. Not guilt, exactly. Something more complicated. The look of a person encountering a fact they knew abstractly and finding that the concrete version of it is different from the abstraction. Harry in real life, in proper clothes, looking back at him without flinching, was different from Harry as a concept in a strategic plan. Harry held the gaze for 3 seconds and then sat down, because he had nothing to prove and no interest in theater. Apollon sat beside him and laid her documents on the table with the organized efficiency of a woman who has done this before, and Isabel took the chair on Harry's other side, and Apollon settled behind them in the first observer row. Fleur was in the observer section, 2 rows up. Harry could feel the bond direction like a compass without needing to look. The chamber doors opened again and Amelia Bones walked in. She was a solid, broad-shouldered witch with short gray hair and a monocle and the quality of someone who did not need the room to go quiet when she entered, but the room went quiet anyway, out of simple respect for the atmosphere she brought with her. She wore senior Wisingamot robes and carried a leather folder that she set on the raised platform without ceremony and opened to the first page before she'd fully sat down. "Right," she said. "We're here under Section 7 of the Guardianship Review Act, in conjunction with the Veela Bond Declaration filed under the Accord de Lyon. I've reviewed the full submission." She looked up over her monocle with the eyes of someone who has been doing this for decades and has long since lost patience with anything that wastes her time. "I've also reviewed the diagnostic report from Madame Fontaine, which I will say now should be in the record and will be in the record, because its contents are not the kind of thing that gets to remain informal." She looked at Dumbledore's table. "Professor Dumbledore. You've had the Delacour submission and the diagnostic report for 72 hours. Are you and your counsel prepared to respond?" "We are, Madame Bones," the Ministry Legal Counsel said. His name was Clearwater, Isabel had told Harry. Mid-40s, competent, not brilliant. He'd handled Ministry Internal Affairs work for 15 years. He was not, Isabel had assessed, in the same weight class as her, but he was thorough. "Good. Madame Delacour. You filed and you have standing. We begin with you. Apollon stood. She did it without drama, simply stood, gathered her notes with one hand, and looked at the chamber with the composure of a woman who has considered this moment carefully and arrived at it ready. The Veela quality was present but controlled, and Harry understood, watching her, that this too was a deliberate choice. She could have let it out, let the room feel the full weight of her presence. She chose not to. The argument was going to stand on its own. Madam Bones, members of the Wisingamat, she began, in English so precise and clear that even the upper tiers had no trouble hearing her. My daughter Fleur is 11 years old and is a quarter Veela. 8 days ago, at a ministry diplomatic event in this building, her Veela magic recognized a partial soul bond with Harry Potter, age 7. The bond has been verified by my family's senior Veela elder and by Madame Fontaine, whose diagnostic credentials I have placed in evidence. She paused. As a result of that bond verification, we investigated Harry's living situation, as we were both legally entitled and morally obligated to do. What we found is documented in those 47 pages. Another pause. I will not rehearse every finding. But I will say this clearly, Harry Potter has been living in conditions that violate 3 separate provisions of the International Statute of Wizarding Welfare, has had no documented ministry welfare contact in 7 years, has had his magical development systematically suppressed, and has been under covert magical surveillance since the age of 15 months without the knowledge or consent of any legal guardian. She looked at the Wisingamat and then, briefly, at Dumbledore. All of this happened because one person decided in November 1981 that it should, and then ensured that the decision remained invisible to oversight. She sat down. The chamber murmur was immediate and low. Clearwater stood. Madam Bones, the submission conflates several distinct matters, the guardianship placement, which was made in good faith under extraordinary circumstances, the welfare provisions, which require context to properly assess, and the monitoring. I'm aware of what the submission does, Bones said, with a dryness so absolute it functioned as a door closing. That's why I read it. Sit down, Mr. Clearwater. You'll have your time. She looked at the Delacour table. I want the diagnostic findings entered formally before we go further. Madame Fontaine is not present, but I have her sworn statement, which I'm entering as evidence under Rule 14. She gestured to a clerk, who collected copies from Isabel and began distributing them to the Wisingamat members. There was a pause while robes rustled and parchment turned, and Harry watched the faces in the upper tiers as they read. Different faces did different things. Some went carefully neutral, which meant they were deciding what to feel and didn't want to show the deliberation. Some went tight around the eyes, which meant something that read as discomfort. 2 or 3 near the left end of the upper tier had the expression of people who already knew what the document said and were waiting to see what was done about it. One older witch in the 3rd tier read 3 pages and then looked down at Harry and then back at her parchment and pressed her lips together. Mr. Potter, Bones said. Harry stood. You're 7 years old and you've been told you can testify today. Is that still your choice? Yes, Harry said. You understand that testimony in this chamber is sworn and becomes part of the formal record? Yes. All right. Sit if you prefer, we don't require children to stand through testimony. I'll stand, Harry said, because he'd thought about this and standing felt like the right choice, the way the word please had felt like the right choice from Apollon in the atrium. Some things were worth the minor discomfort. Bones looked at him for a moment with an expression that was professionally neutral and also, underneath it, something that acknowledged what he was. Not the Scar's answer look. Something more like the look of a person who has read a file and is now meeting the person in the file and finding that the file, however thorough, did not quite capture the thing itself. Tell us about your living situation, she said. In your own words, starting wherever you want to start. Harry had thought about what Isabel told him. Don't perform. Don't soften. Tell them exactly what it was. He took one breath and began. He started with the cupboard. Not dramatically, he just described it. The dimensions, approximately, because he'd measured it once with his arms. The darkness. The camping cot that appeared when he was 4 because before that it was a blanket on the floor. The spider in the corner that he'd named and talked to because there was no one else. He described it factually, without emotional architecture, the way you describe a room you know well, and the factual quality of it was worse than drama would have been. He talked about food. How it was used. The direct, practical logic of it: you did what was wanted and you were fed adequately, you didn't and you weren't. Not starvation, he clarified, because the Dursleys were not monsters in the theatrical sense, just people who had made a decision about what he was worth and then been consistent about it. He talked about school. About keeping his grades below Dudley's because getting above Dudley had consequences. About teachers who occasionally looked at him with mild concern and then looked away because looking away was easier. About the library books, which no one had thought to restrict, and how he'd read everything he could get his hands on because reading was the only thing that was reliably his. He talked about magic. The incidents, the sink, the roof, the vanishing glass at the zoo, the time his hair grew back overnight after Petunia cut it and she'd been so furious she'd locked him in the cupboard for 2 days. He talked about the feeling of it, the compression, the hand over the torch. He talked about what it had felt like when it opened, what Fontaine had done and what he'd felt, and the circle of green grass in the Hampshire garden. He talked about the monitoring charm. What it meant, knowing it had been there since he was 15 months old. What it meant that someone had known the state of his magic, the dam and the cracking and the years of it, and had not intervened. He talked, finally, about the bond. Not extensively, just what it had felt like in the atrium, the click, the warmth, the first time in recent memory that something had happened to him that wasn't a problem to be managed. He stopped. The chamber was completely quiet. He hadn't been afraid during any of it, which he noted with the same matter-of-fact quality he'd brought to the rest of it. The room was full of important people who were feeling things he could almost feel himself, the ambient emotional weight of the chamber like weather, and he was standing in the middle of it and none of it frightened him because none of it was aimed at him. It was aimed at the truth of what he'd described, and the truth of what he'd described was simply what had been. "Thank you," Bones said, after a moment. Her voice was exactly level. "Sit down." He sat. Apollin's hand came to rest on the table beside his, not on his hand, just beside it, in the place where a hand rests when someone is choosing not to make a gesture too large but is making it anyway. He didn't look at her. He looked at the table. Then he looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore was looking at him. The careful composure was still present but the assessment underneath it had changed quality, it was no longer the alert stillness of someone gathering information. It was something older and more complicated, the look of a man encountering the full weight of a choice he made long ago and has been managing at a distance ever since. Not guilt, exactly, the architecture was too deliberate for guilt. More like what guilt looks like when it has been rationalized for 7 years and is suddenly face to face with what it rationalized away. Harry looked at him and didn't feel hatred. That surprised him slightly. He felt the cold clarity and the anger that was useful rather than explosive and something else, something that felt like, strangely, sorrow. Not for himself. For the shape of the thing. For a brilliant man who had looked at a baby and a war and a prophecy and had decided, very logically, that certain costs were acceptable, and had lived inside that logic for so long that it had become a part of how he understood right and wrong. He looked away first this time. Clearwater was good, as it turned out. Not as good as Isabel, but considerably more competent than Isabel's initial assessment had suggested, and Harry paid attention to everything he said with the same careful attention he'd been paying to everything for his entire life, because paying attention was survival and also because it was genuinely interesting. Clearwater's argument had 3 pillars. The first was context, 1981, the war, the immediate danger, the need for a decision made quickly under extraordinary pressure. He wasn't wrong about the context. He was wrong about what the context justified, and Isabel addressed that in a methodical 4-minute rebuttal that disassembled each point with the calm of someone taking apart a watch. The second pillar was the blood protection. The Dursleys, Clearwater argued, provided not just accommodation but a specific magical protection, Lily Potter's sacrificial magic, anchored to her sister's bloodline, which created a ward around Harry that had protected him from the remnant forces of Voldemort. This was real, Isabel acknowledged, and documented in the Delacour submission, and was in fact the only justification for Dumbledore's placement that had any substance. She then turned to the evidence Fontaine had noted about Harry's magical development and asked, directly and without embellishment, whether a ward that protected a child from external magical threats while the child experienced prolonged nutritional deprivation and systematic magic suppression was actually protection or whether it was the appearance of protection serving as justification for an arrangement that served purposes beyond the child's welfare. The murmur from the upper tiers said that landed. The third pillar was the monitoring charm, and here Clearwater was visibly less comfortable. He didn't deny the charm. He argued it was a precautionary measure, given the extraordinary circumstances and the prophecy, and here Bones stopped him. The prophecy, she said, in the voice of someone setting something down carefully. Mr. Clearwater. Are you telling this chamber that a prophecy regarding Harry Potter is the justification for a covert monitoring charm placed without legal guardianship authority? A beat. The prophecy is relevant context. I'll determine what's relevant context, Bones said. Does Professor Dumbledore intend to enter the prophecy into evidence? Clearwater looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore, for the first time since the hearing began, made a movement, a slight lean forward, a settling of his hands on the table. The prophecy, he said, and his voice was what Harry had expected it to be, deep, warm, accustomed to being listened to, is a matter of considerable sensitivity, Madam Bones. Its full content concerns Harry's life and the threat posed by Lord Voldemort in a way that goes beyond today's proceedings. With respect, Apollon said, standing, the prophecy has been referenced as justification for decisions that placed my daughter's bondmaid in harmful conditions for 7 years. If it exists and if it is being offered as justification, it should be in the record. The prophecy concerns a power that Voldemort does not possess, Dumbledore said, still in that warm, carefully modulated voice. It concerns the manner in which he may ultimately be defeated. It concerns Harry in a way that requires him to have a certain upbringing, to ensure he remains grounded, humble, unaware of his significance in a way that would corrupt that significance, Professor Dumbledore, Bones said, with a finality that functioned like a closing door. I'm going to stop you there. He stopped. Are you telling this chamber, she said, very clearly, that you made decisions about this child's living conditions based on your assessment of what upbringing would best serve a prophecy? A silence. That his comfort, his welfare, his magical development, his nutrition were secondary considerations to the requirements of a prophecy? I made decisions that I believed served Harry's ultimate well-being. With respect, Professor, you made decisions that served your plan. Bones took her monocle off, a gesture that somehow made her more rather than less formidable. I have been head of the DMLE for 11 years. I have reviewed cases of magical child welfare across the spectrum. And I will tell you that I have rarely read a diagnostic report that documented what Madame Fontaine documented in this one and then been told by the responsible party that they made those decisions in the child's best interests. She held his gaze. The monitoring charm alone carries potential charges under Section 27 of the Magical Practices Act. The welfare violations carry 6 separate civil findings. The absence of legal guardianship documentation, 7 years of it, is a record-keeping failure of a severity that I frankly struggle to characterize diplomatically. Dumbledore said nothing. He looked, for the first time, not like a man managing a situation but like a man in one. Harry watched him from across the table and thought about what Celeste had said. A passenger cannot reach all the way through a person's soul and take that away. He thought about Isabel's words, don't make it easier for them to hear. He thought about his parents, who had died fighting, and about himself in a cupboard reading library books, and about the click in the atrium and the green grass in the Hampshire garden and the tulips that tracked the direction of the bond. He had not been diminished. That was the thing. He had been compressed and hungry and hidden and unwatched, and he had arrived here, in this chamber, intact and angry in the cold useful way and capable of describing what the cupboard was like without flinching, and that was not Dumbledore's doing. That was in spite of Dumbledore's doing. He felt that clearly and completely and filed it, and let the hearing continue. Clearwater's response to Bones was carefully worded and substantially less confident than his opening, and the Wisengamot members in the upper tiers were doing the thing they'd been building to all morning, the murmured conversations, the parchment passing, the visible formation of opinion that in a body like this happened in real time if you knew how to read it. Isabel stood for her final statement and spoke for 9 minutes. She covered the legal findings, the precedent cases, the specific violations, the Article 14b petition and its implications. She was precise and comprehensive and not once raised her voice. At the end she turned to the chamber as a whole and said, "My client is 7 years old. The question before this body is not complex. It is not about prophecies or wars or the greater good. It is about whether a 7-year-old child was owed the basic protections of the law that this body is charged with upholding, and whether those protections were provided. The evidence says they were not. The question is what you are going to do about that." She sat down. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then something happened that Harry hadn't expected. Dumbledore stood. Not to argue. He looked at Clearwater briefly and then looked past him, and he looked at the chamber, and then he looked at Harry. Just Harry, directly and fully, without the composure management that had characterized his expression all morning. "I owe you an apology," he said. It went into the quiet room like a stone into water. Not an explanation. Not a justification. Those exist and I believe in them, but they are not what is appropriate here. He looked at Harry steadily. "I made decisions about your life without your consent or knowledge, in conditions I told myself were necessary. I was not wrong about the necessity, I believe that still. But I was wrong about the cost. I told myself the cost was acceptable because the stakes were what they were, and I did not examine the cost closely because examining it closely would have been inconvenient for the plan." A pause. "You described what that cost looked like, today, and I sat here and listened. And the description does not match what I told myself it would be. That is not a comfortable distance to find between intention and reality." The chamber was very quiet. "I don't accept the apology," Harry said. Not rudely. Clearly. Dumbledore looked at him. "Not yet," Harry said. "Maybe not ever. I don't know. But definitely not here, in the middle of a hearing where it can function as a reason for people to be less rigorous about what actually happened." He held the old wizard's gaze. "If you want to apologize, do it when there's no audience and no strategic reason for it. Then I'll think about whether I believe it." The chamber murmured. Bones was looking at Harry with something that might have been, briefly, the closest thing to surprise she was capable of. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long moment with those very blue eyes, and the complicated look in them was back, the thing that was the sophisticated cousin of guilt, wearing different clothes. And then, slowly, he sat down. "Right," Bones said, after a moment. "We'll break for 20 minutes before deliberation." In the corridor outside, Apollon stood beside Harry while the Wisengamot members filed past for the break, and she didn't say anything for a full minute, which was unusual for her. Then she said, "That was exactly right." "I meant it," Harry said. "I don't think apologies that are useful to the person giving them are worth much." "I know you meant it. That's why it was exactly right." She looked at him. "How are you?" He thought about it. He was aware of his magic, steady and present. He was aware of the bond direction, Fleur in the observer section somewhere behind the chamber doors. He was aware of the cold clarity in his chest that had been there since Fontaine told him about the monitoring charm and had not once faltered. "Fine," he said. "Genuinely fine." "I know," she said, with the quality she'd had since the atrium, the recognition. "I've known since the first afternoon." She looked at the corridor, at the Wisengamot members in their plum robes carrying their cups of tea and their whispered conversations. "There are 4 members up there who are going to vote against us regardless of the evidence. Too much invested in Dumbledore's reputation. There are 6 who were undecided when they walked in. After your testimony, I think 3 of those 6 have moved. Is that enough? It doesn't need to be a majority for the relief we're asking. Section 7 requires only a qualified majority of 2/3 for custody transfer. The preliminary data I'm reading suggests we're close. She paused. The monitoring charm is the piece that's doing the most work. That's what Bones is going to cite. Criminal conduct under Section 27 cannot be justified by good intentions, regardless of the circumstances, and Bones is not the kind of person who looks for reasons to excuse criminal conduct. Fleur appeared from the observer doors and came directly to Harry with the directness of someone who has been sitting still for 2 hours and is done with that. She looked at him in the way that was her version of "Are you all right?", a quick, comprehensive assessment that started at his eyes and went outward. "You were extraordinary," she said. "You couldn't see much from up there. I could see enough. And I could feel," she touched her sternum, the same gesture Harry used, the whole time. "When you were talking about the cupboard, the bond was," she searched for the word, "it was still. Like something holding its breath." She looked at him steadily. "I didn't like it. That kind of still." "I know," he said. "I could feel it too. From this side." They looked at each other across the corridor with the busy, murmuring ministry around them, and the quality of the moment was something Harry didn't have a category for yet, something that was partly the bond and partly the mourning and partly the specific experience of having stood in that chamber and said true things and not been made less by saying them, and finding that the person looking at him knew all of that without needing to be told. Apollon appeared at Apollin's shoulder. He looked at Harry with the same flat, serious regard he'd been using since the first morning in Hampshire. "Bones is going to rule today," he said. "She told Isabel in there, she's not dragging this out. Whatever she decides, it happens today." "Good," Harry said. "Whatever it is, I'd rather know." The deliberation took 40 minutes, which Isabel said was fast for a Section 7 hearing, which typically ran for hours or reconvened on a second day. The fact that it was 40 minutes said something about where the Wisingamat had been before they went in, and the quality of their filing in when the doors reopened said something more. The 4 members who'd been going to vote no regardless looked brisk and resolute, which meant they'd made their case and lost it, and the 6 undecideds had the slightly stunned look of people who have just been in a room where something became clear. Harry sat down. He didn't feel nervous. The cold clarity was steady and the warmth was steady, and Fleur was back in the observer section and he could feel the bond direction. Whatever was coming, he'd been here since the beginning. He was going to be here for the end. Bones looked at the filing in front of her and then looked at the chamber. "This body finds," she said, in her brisk, carrying voice, "under Section 7 of the Guardianship Review Act, that the guardianship arrangement established in November 1981 by Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore regarding the minor Harry James Potter was established without proper legal authority, maintained without required oversight, and resulted in conditions that violate provisions 3, 7, and 12 of the International Statute of Wizarding Welfare." She turned a page. "We further find that the monitoring charm documented in evidence, placed without legal authority on a minor's magical core, constitutes a violation of Section 27 of the Magical Practices Act, and this matter is referred to the DMLE's Criminal Investigation Division for further proceedings." She turned another page. "Regarding the Article 14b petition under the Accord de Lyon, the Delacour family's petition for interim guardianship, pending the establishment of a permanent arrangement, is granted. Harry James Potter is formally placed in the interim care of Apollon and Apollon Delacour, effective immediately upon conclusion of this hearing." The chamber did not erupt. The Wisingamat was too composed for eruption. But the controlled murmur that moved through the upper tiers had the quality of something large happening under a surface that was keeping itself appropriate. Harry sat with the words "effective immediately" and let them become real. Additionally, Bones continued, with the air of someone saving something for the end, "Given the documented impact of the guardianship arrangement on the minor's magical development, and the verified Veela bond requiring proximity for proper development of both bonded individuals, This chamber recommends that the interim guardians consider magical educational arrangements that keep both bonded parties in reasonable proximity until the bond has stabilized. This is a recommendation, not an order. The Delacours have full discretion in educational matters during the interim period. That was the Beauxbatons option, Harry understood. Not ordered. Opened. Professor Dumbledore, Bones said, looking at him directly over her monocle. The criminal referral regarding the monitoring charm will proceed through the DMLE. You are not at this time charged, but you are under investigation, and you should govern yourself accordingly. The Chamber further notes that your role as Hogwarts headmaster and Wisengamot member creates questions of conflict of interest regarding your past actions as de facto guardian that may require separate address. Those questions are deferred to the Oversight Committee. She closed her folder. That concludes this hearing. She stood. The Chamber stood with her. It was over. Dumbledore left without speaking to Harry again, with Clearwater at his side and the administrative witch behind them. At the door he paused, and Harry thought for a moment he was going to turn, and then he didn't. He walked out and the door closed, and the legal documents were being collected and the Wisengamot members were filing down and Isabel was shaking hands with someone from the DMLE office. Apollon put her hand on Harry's shoulder. An actual hand this time, not beside his hand, a real, direct contact, the gesture of a guardian who has just formally become one. He looked up at her. Effective immediately, he said. Yes, she said. What happens now? Now we go home, she said. And tomorrow we start planning what comes next. Fontaine has 3 more sessions scheduled. Isabel has paperwork. Apollon has to make calls to Paris. She looked at him with the same expression she'd worn in the ministry atrium 8 days ago when she'd crouched to his eye level, the recognition, the resolution. And you have the rest of your life to figure out, which is not as frightening as it sounds because you're going to do it surrounded by people who are paying attention. Fleur appeared at Harry's other side, descending from the observer section with her chin up and her silver hair catching the chamber torchlight, and she looked at him and said, without any of the 11-year-old dignity management, "Come on then." He stood. His magic was warm and large and present and moving in the direction it always moved when he stopped directing it, toward the bond, toward Fleur, toward the particular quality of warmth that had nothing to do with danger or containment or blood protections built on sacrifice. Just the bond, choosing its direction, because that was what it did. He picked up his coat from the back of the chair. He walked out of the courtroom between the Delacours and into a corridor that was still the Ministry of Magic, still amber-lit and busy and full of important people making decisions, and none of those decisions were about him anymore in the way they'd been before. He was no longer in a plan. He was in a life.